Hello and a very warm welcome to the closing event of the first research sprint, AI and content moderation. My name is Jennifer Sarah Boone and it is a great pleasure to lead you through this evening. When is it necessary to block content? How can you make sure no illegal speech makes it on your site? Where do you draw the line between hate speech and freedom of expression, and what does it look like on a global perspective? Will you stay behind if you draw the line at a different level as others? Hosted by the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, 13 international researchers from various disciplines stuck their heads virtually together for the past 10 weeks to answer these questions and more. Today, we will learn more about their findings and dive deeper into the ethics of digitalization in our panel, where you, dear viewers, will have the possibility to ask your questions. We have reached a milestone with quite a few to come, but you must celebrate every successful step of the way. And of course, such a huge project as this one would not be possible without a joint effort of many. So I would like to thank the German Federal President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, for being the patron of the project and the launch event that marked the beginning of the first research sprint. A huge thank you goes out to the Stiftung Mercator for their support, and of course to the NOC as a whole, and specifically to our partner institute, Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And last but most definitely not least, a big thank you goes out to all fellows of the first research sprint for their hard work, for their brilliant minds, and for their innovative outcomes. And now, without further ado, I'm honored to hand the word over to Research Director Wolfgang Schulz and Research Lead Alexander Pirang to officially open this event.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to, first of all, to echo the thanks to all the people you mentioned, because we are feel really privileged that we can do this project, that we can be the coordinator of this NOC project here. And I would like to take only 2 minutes to explain why this project is so important to us and why we believe that we can really make a difference with this project. The starting point of thinking about these format that we have designed here together with our colleagues was that there are a lot of ideas being tossed around about ethics and digitalization. We have a lot of codices already. We have academic efforts as well as practical initiatives. But to some extent, these initiatives do not have the traction that they should have here in practice. And our idea was to move from the principle level to a very concrete level of problem solving. And that's what we are trying to do with this project in different steps, as mentioned above. Second thing, when you think about how can that be achieved, you have to think about specific formats of knowledge production. You have to bring people together with different disciplinary backgrounds, with different cultural backgrounds, and other aspects play a role as well. So the composition of the process, the composition of the group, I think is of huge importance, and that's why we have created together with our colleagues this format of sprints that are structured in a very, very specific way. And this was actually the first sprint that we have organized in this context. And I can already say that it has worked out really well. And congratulations to the fellows that have embarked on this journey together with us, and I'm really looking forward to the next minutes to see specifically what came out of this. The first sprint has a specific problem in mind, and we choose this problem of content moderation and new technologies with a purpose. And how that worked out and what the specific sprint was about can be best explained by Alexander Pirang, and I hand over to him. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer and Wolfgang, and good evening to you all. My name is Alexander Pirang. I'm a researcher at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. It has been my pleasure to support the research sprint on AI and content moderation as scientific co-lead, together with my colleagues Matthias Kettemann and Christian Katzel. In the next minutes, I will tell you more about the sprint and its protagonists. As Wolfgang said, our aim was to do highly interdisciplinary work. So we assembled a group of participants that we felt could tackle the topic from all angles. We ended up having 13 brilliant fellows working in 9 different countries, and if my geography is right, across 7 different time zones. Their academic expertise ranges from law and public policy to data science and digital ethics. Together, they worked on a key challenge in online communication spaces. The use of AI in content moderation raises human rights concerns, but at the same time, automation is needed to deal with the huge volume of online content. The fellows tackled these highly complex issues over the course of 10 weeks. They engaged with leading experts in the field, but most importantly, they had fascinating discussions among themselves. This journey was challenging at times. Research usually feels more like a marathon than a sprint, but in our case, the time pressure was high right from the start. And mind you, this all took place virtually during a pandemic. In the end, the fellows more than met our expectations. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your motivation and your intellectual curiosity. You made this a lot of fun for all of us involved. But fun was not the only thing we got out of this. The fellows worked in groups to produce 3 policy briefs that make key recommendations on implementing effective algorithmic audits and on improving the transparency and accountability of algorithmic content moderation systems. I will stop here and let the fellows present their findings in more detail.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang Schulz and Alexander Pirang, for your opening words. And yes, as you said, Alexander, now is the time for us to learn what the output of our 3 groups of the research sprint are. So let me welcome from the group on black box breakouts, PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow, Great Britain, Aline Iramina, to give us the first insights.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm gonna try to share my screen to make my presentation. So, okay, here. Well, I'm responsible for presenting my group's policy brief, disclosure rules for algorithm content moderation, a call for more transparency regulations for social media platforms. For our policy brief, our focus was on platforms' transparency and accountability in algorithm content moderation. Alongside human content moderators, algorithm content moderation systems are increasingly deployed to deal with harmful and illegal content distributed on social media platforms, such as fake news and hate speech. But what's the problem about that? Well, as far as we know, algorithm content moderation systems are far from perfect. Algorithms usually do not understand context, so often they block too much or block too little content, and platform overblocking, for example, can lead to restriction of freedom of speech and creation, also can have other negative impacts on fundamental rights. Besides that, algorithm can reproduce social bias against marginalized group, which can have negative impact and also result in discrimination of minorities. In this context, platforms release very little information about the use of these automated systems, which prevent public oversight and obstruct regulators from formulating appropriate responses to protect individual rights and public interest. given this context, in our research, we had two main questions that we would like to address. First, how transparent are platforms about their algorithm content moderation practices? And the second one was how governments can ensure more transparency from platforms about the use of these algorithm content moderation systems. So our first question was to start, what and how do platforms disclose? As far as we could see, platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and etc., they disclose some limited information in transparency reports, corporate blogs, and press releases. However, information contained in transparency reports and other channels is not standardized across platforms. The information they give us are very limited. Key metrics are missing, which difficults public oversight. And also, such transparency channels exist mostly for public purpose, so public relations purpose. So they highlight areas that platforms want to highlight and hide areas that they want to hide. To be able to propose legal solutions, we analyze current legislations from different countries, from different parts of the world, such as the US, the EU, German, Brazil, also Singapore and other countries. And what we realize is that none of these legislations for platforms take into account the risks involved in the use of AI systems for public disclosure, freedom of expressions, and other fundamental rights. More recent legislations does not differentiate between human and automated content moderation. Some of them provide for general transparency requirements, such as the obligation to publish transparency reports, but none of them explicitly require platforms transparency and algorithm content moderation. So taking all this into account, for us, what was clear is that the first step to guarantee more transparency and accountability from platforms in algorithm content moderation is through the implementation of binding and specific disclosure rules. So for us, we think that regulators, lawmakers, they should work on provisions that clearly define platforms' transparency requirements and explicitly enforce data disclosure in terms of algorithm content moderation. So specifically in our policy brief, we propose 3 policy recommendations. The first one is binding and specific disclosure obligations in the algorithm content moderations. We believe that they should be on multiple levels. So we suggest 3 different levels. Using-facing disclosure, for example, users should be notified in their content if their content has been removed by algorithms. The second level should be civil society and research disclosures. In this case, allowing, for example, access to databases and allowing as well independent audits. And the third level would be general disclosure. Platforms should publish specific statistics and information that can be seen by all. And in these terms, we also propose some of the information that should be included in this general disclosure. For example, number of automated detections and removal, explanation of how system works and also how accurate they are, and announcement of new AI rules out. Finally, to complement this first and the main proposal, we also propose 2 other policy recommendations. Would be that users should have the option to appeal content moderation decisions. So lawmakers should legally require platforms to adopt robust and accessible content moderation appeal mechanism. And finally, the establishment of an independent regulatory body that would be responsible for regulating, monitoring, and enforcement disclosure with a multi-stakeholder group or body oscillating in this rulemaking process, and preferably, if possible, in a co-regulatory structure. And that's our main proposal. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please. Thank you.
Aline, thank you so much for sharing your team's knowledge on the black box breakouts. Before we carry on, I would like to dig in a little deeper with 2 questions. considering that upload filters are highly politicized, especially in the EU context, do you see a risk that transparency rules in this context may also turn out to be controversial, as they might be perceived as implicit condoning of filtering practices?
Not exactly, because actually platforms already use this kind of filtering, so I don't think they will stop using it despite anything, and they are necessary when you talk about the amount of content that you have distributed and circulating in this kind of platform. So I think the fact that filters and these automated systems, they will be used and increasingly used by platforms. But the thing is, not only governments, but also researchers and the society as a whole should have at least knowledge of how they work. They should be able to audit if it's necessary. They should be able to understand how it works, and also if they think that there is something wrong, to demand, for example, more information and everything. So that's the idea about transparency.
So you don't think it's an option that you don't have the filters? You say, as you have the filters anyway, they need to be transparent.
Exactly. I think that it's quite complicated to think about internet today, especially all these platforms, that they won't use any kind of filter or any kind of automated system to control the level of information, everything that is being transmitted online. So I think the idea is that they already use, and I think they will use even more. So at least they should be transparent.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. And rights definitely need to be protected. How can platforms make sure that anyone affected by automated tools can seek compensation? Are internal mechanisms enough, or is an ombudsperson necessary? And if yes, should this be an independent institution situated with media authorities or consumer protection authorities?
Well, in our proposal, one of our recommendation was, and it's actually being a recommendation that we saw from many civil society groups and a lot of people recommending that, is that you should oblige platforms to have appeal mechanisms, like that are easily access, that people can easily access. So the idea is that the first way is that, at least if they think that there is something wrong, they can use this kind of mechanism. But of course, you always have the courts that you can appeal. And in terms of, for example, if you talk about, we also propose independent regulatory body. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea. What we proposed was a co-regulatory approach. We know that this is kind of controversial because what's co-regulatory is sometimes not very clear. But the idea is that you should have a governmental body that's responsible for implementing these disclosure rules, and that if someone, for example, if someone feels that they are being harmed by the use of by the use of these automated systems, they can at least go after their rights. And then it's not only necessary in courts, but also with this governmental body that would have at least a multi-stakeholder group to assist. And then that's what we actually, in our policy brief, we decided to leave a little bit open, because we know that governments have different structures. For example, probably Europe has more structure than a developing country. So what we mean is that they should be able to appeal or to have some kind of mechanism to ask for, how can I say, to be able to have their rights guaranteed. But maybe it's not only on the courts, but also in some other governmental body or this other co-regulatory body.
Well, thank you so much, Alina, and of course to the entire team. Thank you very much. So we're moving on to our next group, where David Morar, guest researcher at George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, USA, will be sharing his group's findings on audits.
Ways to make AI use in content moderation not just transparent, but also accountable. We know that platforms are using algorithms in their interactions with user-created content, and we know that because the companies themselves tell us that. But we don't know much more than that. By design or by happenstance, the algorithms are not visible to the general public, or more importantly, to regulators. The questions that arise then are where, how, and in what capacity are platforms using artificial intelligence? Not only do users need to know this in order to make informed decisions about engaging with specific platforms, but as our name suggests, we believe it is crucial for regulators to have this information in order to base their subsequent policy actions on solid data rather than hype or fear-mongering. Policymakers across the spectrum and around the world are increasingly looking into various forms of transparency-oriented or information-forcing regulation. Our work posits that audits of algorithmic content moderation systems should be required by law, and in order to be legitimate and beneficial, should at a minimum fulfill the following 4 criteria. Independence. The audit should be conducted or certified by independent third parties. Access. The platform must not pick and choose the level of and to whom to afford access. Publicity. The audit must be made widely available and to an extent understandable to the public. And finally, resourceful, which we take to mean broadly that it should be properly funded, built, and undertaken through an expertise-rich environment. What do we mean by audits? We conceive audits as a tool for regulators to enhance transparency. Now, of course, there are many ways to enhance transparency. So what isn't an audit then? In particular, we address 4 types of measures. First, notice. Whether it is for copyright or for content moderation broadly on platforms, notices aren't audits. Second, we talk about transparency reports. Soft law standards found in co-regulatory schemes like the EU Code of Conduct on disinformation. This type of transparency measure has also been included in different national legal instruments in Germany, Brazil, and Turkey. However, some regulators have found this sort of measure insufficient for adequate oversight and monitoring. Third, we look into data access regimes, such as Social Science 1. Platforms can also enter into specific data sharing arrangements with government or researchers. While these measures help researchers and policymakers to better understand automated systems, their voluntary nature is potentially challenging for regulators to design reliable regulatory measures for automated systems. Finally, within the context of AI systems, we have several initiatives of algorithmic registers. Such a register is aimed at achieving a baseline for transparency, and it's now being tested in Amsterdam and Helsinki. Public registers as mechanisms for mandatory reporting are the goal in this project. So all of these measures enhance transparency in different ways, but they're not audits, even if regulators sometimes assume they are. So then how do we conceptualize audits in the context of algorithms? An algorithmic audit offers a concrete mechanism for assessing whether automated processes comply with the law, internal company rules, and or regulation. Audits, unlike other similar tools such as impact assessments, which usually occur before a new technology is adopted, can occur at any time. Audits are seen as a great answer to understanding not just the seemingly ubiquitous role of algorithms in our lives, but also the extent to which these algorithms end up deepening, perpetuating bias or discrimination. However, the same people proposing audits as answers are left powerless to actually follow through due to severe lack of access from the platforms. This over-reliance on confidentiality as a default supposedly stems from a desire to protect trade secrets, the integrity of automated decisions, and other similar interests. Which brings us to our next important point. Audits are useful to policymakers as well in order to gather information about compliance with legal and regulatory obligations. However, unlike researchers, they can actually require platforms to submit to audits. Simply legislating it, however, will not ensure that audits will be consequently useful. The technological complexity of the varied methods by which companies choose to interact with user-created content means that specific and substantial technological expertise is required in order to both create and perform audits meaningfully. Now let's get into benefits and risks. One of the main benefits of audits for regulators is material information on how an AI system works. This is essential to enable the verifiability and explainability of these systems. There is academic consensus that only disclosing the code to regulators is not enough to verify automated systems, since the code by itself, without explanation, does not allow regulators to assess and make recommendations on how to improve. A crucial benefit of implementing algorithmic audits is that it allows regulators to go beyond risk-based assessment frameworks. These frameworks were implemented by companies as a way of compliance. This approach often underlooks social and ethical challenges and only focuses on probabilities. However, in the context of AI systems, researchers consider that audits could be used as a mechanism. It could check ex ante whether the design and implementation processes are in line with ethical expectations and standards. Finally, audits provide a transparency trail for regulator. The systematic challenges for understanding an AI model are tracing the provenance of training data and interpreting the meaning of model weights. These two factors influence the risk profile of an automated system. Therefore, traceability, understood as documenting the relationship between product requirements, their source, and system design, helps close the gap on automated system use accountability. There are, of course, risks associated with audits. Primarily among them, the idea that regulatory oversight can be leveraged in ways that are regressive, and more broadly speaking, transparency can be captured or made useless. We've written and you've heard me talk about audits both broadly and in detail. We believe that in order for society and more importantly policymakers to understand the role and impact of artificial intelligence used by platforms and subsequently legislate and regulate appropriately, a good first step is to operationalize specific aspects of transparency, in particular audits. Further, in order for these audits to truly be beneficial and actually make a legitimate impact, we believe that any legislation that requires audits should also enshrine 4 principles that, based on our research, can make or break the usefulness of audits. First, the audits have to be independent. They must not rely on the platform to conduct them and should be at a minimum certified by an independent third party in order to escape capture. Second, and imperatively, access must be afforded to auditors outside of any vetting or internal decision-making by the company. Thirdly, the audit has to be publicized widely, have its results presented and translated to the general public. And finally, the audits, a resource-dependent undertaking, should be well-funded, staffed with expertise, and generally properly resourced in order to successfully carry out its mission.
Thank you very much, David. The bad news, David cannot be here to answer my questions, but the good news is that Angelica Fernandez, fellow of the research sprint and PhD candidate at the University Luxembourg, will be taking on that part. Thank you so much for being with us. So my first question would be, are audits of algorithmic content moderation systems enough to provide insights into platforms' governance processes? Shouldn't we aim for a broader auditing scope that also takes human review and semi-automated moderation into account?
Hello. So actually, when we thought about it, we and in the white paper we developed alongside with David and Hannah Block-Weber, actually we thought of it as a measure that empowers regulators, but that sits alongside all the other transparency measures that David mentioned in his video. Notice transparency reports, sort of access to data access regimes, and the sort of algorithm registered trend that is going on for algorithms are used in public services. So we don't think it's one measure, but it's like all the measures together that will guarantee that we're able to look under the hood of these companies and really sort of rein them in or provide an adequate oversight. But because we chose that our target audience for the white paper were policymakers, then of course we focus more on this benefit, which is the one, well, as explained, David, about access granular data and be able to provide, adequate measures.
If you call for audit, thank you. If you call for audits, what are the conditions under which such an audit can lead to insights and a more robust rights protection architecture? Don't we have audits in a way when NetzDG, for example, the reports are made?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that NetzDG, it's not audits, but it's more transparency reports, which, as we said, may have some of the elements that we traditionally understand as being audit, because we take this notion from maybe the financial sector, but it's not audits of algorithms as we understand it. So we make that very clear on the white paper, why this type of audit is different and what are the elements that make it different from all the other transparency measures that we see right now, and that they do serve some interest and are useful for some things, but not necessarily to empower regulators and to provide a better oversight, which is what we wanted to achieve with it. Also, a very important thing that David mentioned was that in our paper, we highlight the fact that audits have this sort of procedure and formality to it, right? And that's really important because it makes them credible, and it makes them also in a way that enhances trust in the ecosystem. And I think that's trust is something that is missing between the companies, between platforms, between users, between regulatory authorities. So we think that also from that point of view, audits will make it, it's a really good measure to implement, and that it will be beneficial for the society and for the relationship between regulators and platforms and companies in general.
Okay, thank you. And one very smart question I most definitely did not come up with is the Romans ask, quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Please apologize for my terrible Latin. So what it means is, who is watching the watchers? Is it enough to provide an auditing process, or do we need more transparency rules for the auditors themselves?
Yes, so we discussed that because obviously when we say that one of the principles in which we think that audits should be based is independence, and so independence from whom, and then the devils is in the details, and then we consider different, and in the white paper we detailed 3 different possibilities about how could we operationalize and implement actually this, and how we guarantee that independence. And so that there, for example, we take different models, as I said, but one of them will be that maybe there is sort of, as it's been traditional in Europe for media regulation, that there is sort of a national supervisory regulatory body that will be independent and then will watch over. And another idea that we had that we detail also in the paper is to have a sort of a body composed of different sectors, so like a stakeholder type of body that will take on that task. So we thought about it, and it's included in the paper. You then have to read it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Angelica. Thank you, of course, to David as well, and to the entire team.
Okay, thank you.
We are coming to our final group. Platform values is their topic, and we will learn what exactly that means from lecturer at the University of Tilburg, Netherlands, Sunimal Mendes.
So I hope you can all see my presentation now. The title of our policy brief is Freedom of Expression in the Digital Public Sphere, Strategies for Bridging Information and Accountability Gaps in Algorithmic Content Moderation. Our normative starting point is that social media platforms constitute a shared social infrastructural resource and form a co-component of the digital public sphere, where a substantial amount of contemporary public discourse takes place. So, although typically subject to private ownership, these platforms are in fact engaged in a public function, and as such, their governance should reflect this public-private partnership. Safeguarding the freedom of expression, or FOE, on these platforms is essential for fostering healthy and robust public discourse. Therefore, we argue that, in accordance with their positive obligations to protect FOE, states have a duty to ensure that FOE is adequately safeguarded on social media platforms, especially in content moderation. Now, content moderation, or CM, is a governance mechanism used by platforms to ensure that their users see, hear, or speak no evil. But inaccuracies and inefficiencies of the CM system can violate users' FOE by wrongfully suppressing lawful speech. What is even worse is that in some cases, speech that is actually permitted by law can be removed by the CM system simply by reason of its non-compliance with the platform's terms of service and community standards. Now, at the moment, states adopt a largely hands-off approach to governing CM systems deployed by platforms. As a result, platforms have a wide discretion to design and implement their CM systems and to determine the type of content permitted on their platforms, subject to minimal state regulation and oversight. As platforms do not bear any legal responsibility for failure to implement fundamental rights safeguards laid down in law, they currently have little incentive to ensure that CM systems are designed and implemented in a way that adequately safeguards FOE, while at the same time adequately shielding users from exposure to illegal or harmful content. Now, recent years have seen a rise in the use of automated content moderation systems, or ACM. This can be attributed to three main reasons. Firstly, the increase in the volume of content and the number of users, which makes it very difficult to engage in content moderation purely by means of human review. And therefore, as AI technology is widely available and can prove faster and more efficient, there is a natural tendency on the part of platforms to opt to deploy this new technology. Secondly, more stringent regulatory measures that impose a higher degree of liability on platforms for hosting illegal or harmful content pressurize platforms to engage in more proactive monitoring and filtering of content. This, in turn, requires the deployment of ACM. Finally, the corona effect has pushed platforms to rely even more on ACM due to the unavailability of human moderators during the lockdown period. The empirical research we undertook demonstrates that the current state of ACM technology has inherent shortcomings, such as being context blind, language dependent, and incapable of processing certain types of data. Interestingly, the data gathered from YouTube shows that with the increased use of ACM in 2020 due to the corona situation, the reinstatement share of wrongfully removed content doubled, while the number of appeals remained constant. This leads us to the hypothesis that the increased use of ACM without substantial human oversight results in higher levels of wrongful removal and disabling of legitimate content. If so, then the proliferation of ACM substantially enhances the risks to FOE. Thus, there is a need to revisit the current regulatory framework in order to ensure that the risk posed by CM, or content moderation, to FOE is minimized. As a first step towards doing so, we identified two main weaknesses in the current framework that need to be urgently remedied. The first is the information gap. This refers to the inadequacy of information that is currently available to regulators and other interested parties, such as researchers and civil society groups, to understand the way in which CM impacts on FOE. The second is the accountability gap. This is caused by the absence of effective complaints and redress mechanisms by which users can challenge wrongful removal or disabling of lawful speech. In our policy brief, we urge regulators to take a more proactive role in supervising and regulating CM systems deployed by social media platforms. And we outline a two-layered proposal for bridging the information and accountability gaps we identified before. At the first layer, we propose the introduction of enforceable statutory obligations on platforms that would require them to provide detailed quarterly reports on the removals and the complaints they have received and the reinstatements they have carried out. In addition, an enforceable statutory obligation to provide periodic fundamental rights impact assessments, which would identify the risks posed by the content moderation systems, and particularly the ACM, to the freedom of expression, and detail what steps the platform has taken to mitigate these risks. In addition, we also propose the introduction of an enforceable statutory obligation for all platforms to establish effective complaints and redress mechanisms. At the second layer, we propose the establishment of an ombudsman who will be authorized to supervise and assist platforms in ensuring that their CM systems are capable of adequately safeguarding FOE. The ombudsman will also be authorized to review any decisions delivered by the platforms pursuant to their complaints and redress process, thereby further enhancing accountability. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and my team and I are eager to hear your comments and feedback, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, Sunimaya, thank you so much for the final presentation. And of course, I have some questions for you as well. Could you explain to us what exactly the difference is between the Ombudsman approach and Facebook's oversight board? And how do you see potential conflicts due to diverging decisions between ombudsperson and the oversight board playing out?
Thank you, Jennifer, for that question. Yes, that's an important question. So we envision the ombudsman as sort of being at a higher level to all the sort of voluntary mechanisms that certain platforms such as Facebook have already put in place. And why we are pushing for an ombudsman is because the crux of our argument is that social media platforms, although they're privately owned, are in fact a part of contemporary social infrastructure that is available to the public, which is why I highlighted at the outset of my presentation that the governance of these platforms should be framed in terms of this public-private partnership. According to that, we feel that it is time that governments take on a more positive responsibility to ensure that these platforms are governed in a way that ultimately serves the public interest. And by introducing an ombudsman who will be authorized to regulate and supervise the governance of these platforms, particularly the CM systems and the extent to which they are able to safeguard FOE, we make sure that this overarching governance mechanism is integrated within the public administrative framework, which enhances its accountability, enhances its neutrality and independence, and also makes it easier for members of the public and other stakeholders to influence it, to interact with it in a more open manner.
Thank you very much. You said transparency is very important. Transparency of the algorithmic tools or of the processes that go into them? Transparency for the public, more transparency for scientists? What do you feel is most important?
So this is why we don't really use the term transparency. We opted to use the term information gap because we feel it is a stronger term than transparency. If you look at our policy brief, of course, we present a very detailed proposal, which also includes the type of information we feel should be made available to the Ombudsman and then also to the public, because one of the tasks of the Ombudsman will be to maintain a website, a publicly accessible website, where he can publish appropriately redacted versions of the reports, the FRIAs, and the quarterly reports on complaints and redress that he receives from the platforms. The information will relate to, for example, the choice for the deployment of a particular algorithmic content moderation system, the design of the algorithmic content moderation system, as well as its deployment. It will also include information on the type of content that has been removed, the reasons why the algorithmic system decided this content should be removed, because one thing that needs to be highlighted is that it's not the algorithm per se that creates the problem, it's also the sort of training data according to which the algorithm is trained. So what is important is to really understand why the algorithm makes certain decisions rather than it's just core functionality. When we talk about information gap, this relates to a variety of categories of information. So not just information about the technology, but also the sort of underlying reasons why the complaints have been made against unlawful takedown, the reason for reinstatements, so everything.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sunimal, for your insightful answers and of course for sharing your group's outcome.
Thank you.
Well, that was a lot of fascinating, interesting, and innovative information that we already received. Thank you all again, of course. Now we're going to dig in a little deeper into the topic and head straight into our panel discussion. And I want to sincerely invite all of you to participate. This discussion is supposed to be open to everyone. You have the possibility to submit your questions and then they will be discussed along in the panel. So please feel free to ask whatever you want and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And now for the panel, I would like to welcome back Angelica Fernandez, who you already met in our Q&A session. She will be joining our panel. Thank you for that. Welcome, Angelica. And additionally, to enrich our discussion, I may welcome Matthias Kettemann, Associated Researcher at the HIIG and Scientific Lead of the Research Project, Regulatory Structures and the Emergence of Rules in Online Spaces at the Leibniz Institute for Media Research, Hans Bredow Institute. Very warm welcome to you, Matthias. And to make our panel complete, I am happy that Nikolai Horn also agreed to take the time today. He is philosopher and in the team Research and Projects at iRights Lab. Thank you all for being here.
My pleasure.
Can we see everyone and hear everyone? Yes. Okay. So when it comes to the ethics of digitalization, there are almost endless aspects up for discussion. Angelica, how did you narrow down the large research area of AI and content moderation to the outputs that we heard today?
Yeah, so that was really hard to do, especially because we all came from different disciplines, different backgrounds. So really narrowing down took us a lot of the weeks we had for the research, sort of daunting to do it. So what we did was first of all to get to know each other, to what was our expertise also, because we wanted to contribute to the ongoing debates in this area, but from a really like innovative way or a meaningful way at least. So we put all that knowledge base together, and then we sort of compare it also with what has come of the at the kickoff conference with the president, where there was an expert discussions, and they identify some of the gaps in the research area of AI and content moderation, because we also wanted to that the topic that we were going to discuss, that we're going to choose to research on, will respond to an actual need that was identified. So then we sort of did the matching of those two to narrow it even further. And then from there, we just have to choose where we were so many, right? So we divided into 4 groups, basically. And then, yeah, we just start working. And then when we started working, it became more obvious how to narrow it down, because we had to choose a target audience to be able to create a meaningful, output. So in our case, for example, we decided will be policymakers. So that already gives it an angle and narrows down even an issue that we're taking that could be very broad. And then I also have to say that the fact that we have access to a group of mentors who were available and were kind enough to spend time with us to sort of even, narrow even further what we already had in our minds, and sort of go through the first draft and validate our ideas, and also the need for us to discuss these, the topic that we chose in our case, algorithmic audits. So that was really helpful. In our case, we had access to a discussion with Julia Rita and Nelson Mackenzie, and that was really great. They went into the substantial questions to help us narrow it down, but also to the format of the output for the intended audience. So that helped us a lot. And it was really at the end of the research, there were so many good questions that we wanted to tackle and that we just couldn't. So it was a really hard exercise, but I think we're all proud of what we achieved.
Well, congratulations anyway, of course, from my side. We already spoke about that in after the first presentation, that machines are highly imperfect, but it is also necessary to monitor and control the huge volume of online content. Given this predicament, is it better to focus on improving automated systems by making them more accountable and transparent, or to give more information, as Sumaya said? I will ask this question again, or should we be more radical and even question if these systems should be used at all? Matthias, can I hand the question to you?
Oh, absolutely. I'm all for radical ideas. Radical means going to the source of the problem, radex. Like to go down the Latin road once again. But the source of the problem here lies in the volume of content that is published each second. Each second we talk, hours of content is uploaded. No human person would be able to deal with that. Platforms have started, pushed by the legislators, they have started to build up human competences in relation to content moderation, but they cannot deal with the content without automatic tools. So we need automated tools, but we need to make them better. And the researchers of our sprint have shown which ethical and legal approaches exist to make those tools better, to open up the black box of automated content moderation.
Thank you. Seeing that the big scale efforts by a platform to, for example, tackle coronavirus misinformation and to try and provide objective facts on the pandemic, do you see any promising signs that platforms are starting to take more responsibility for the online public world. Nikolai, may I hand the question to you?
Yes, the public pressure rise on, so I think they do this. But in my opinion, the main question is to be sure what we are talking about when we are talking about disinformation or fake news. So in my opinion, we have to go a few steps back and ask ourselves what should be actually be regulated. What is the meaning of illegal? What is illegal? So in Germany, we have our law, but in other countries are other laws. So which laws is basic for this understanding? And much more important, in my opinion, to have understanding what do we mean, what is harmful, how we define harmfulness. Because in every country, every culture, every continent, we have another understanding about harmfulness. Something what in Germany may be harmful. So to talk about German as the nation, as in USA, no problem. There's another historical context, another society. So in my opinion, before we start to regulate, before we start to find out what the appropriate aid of a way of regulation or legitimation with each instrument should be should something be regulated, we should ensure ourselves what we are talking about. Actually, the same problem by the values, like transparency. What is transparency? Is transparency a value? In my opinion, not. Value is a freedom of expression, freedom, so self-determination, and transparency is an instrument. But this question, you have introduced me like philosopher. In my opinion, we have to be sure about the terms we are talking about, because these terms are basically for next steps how we regulate something and how we control our regulation.
But how can that be achieved? Like, who makes the framework? Who decides what the terms are? Especially, as you say, from country to country, it differs. So how can you find a consent and say, okay, this is what we are talking about?
More importantly, as the consent is the fact to ask this question. Because in the process of asking, we have a discourse. Maybe we don't find exactly definition of what transparency is or what harmfulness, but with this discourse, we avoid that, for example, that we try to minimize harmfulness. So we define as a harmful only that all states understand as harmful, and at the end we have really few things what are not harmful in any opinion. So in the process of discussing, we will never define finally the things, but the process of self-understanding has a value on itself. And it makes the regulators better to understand what they have to regulate and how.
Thank you. Matthias.
To add on to that, so I believe that the use of the term harmful when it comes to content is extremely harmful to a good discussion and debate, because nobody knows what they're talking about. If you take the UK example, where harmfulness was introduced as a term of art for online content moderation, you see just chaos everywhere. Harmful is not a good term to use. We need to clearly distinguish between illegal content and content that is not illegal. Illegal content is something which usually democratically elected parliamentarians decide on for a specific country. If a state provides that too much speech is illegal, then that state violates its commitments under international freedom of expression commitments. That's international law, that's clear. But it's a whole other debate on what within a society should be considered as problematic. We do have to remind ourselves, especially in times of today, that the European Court of Human Rights in an important judgment reminded us that especially information that some people might find offensive, that some people might find hurtful, is also protected by freedom of expression, not only ideas that everybody agrees with. And this is why I think we've only just started to talk about the role of platforms and how they engage with content that has the potential through the dynamics and mechanics of the distribution of content on those platforms, the amplification and the goals they optimize for, which usually are not great discourse, but usually making money, how that impacts societal realities, social cohesion.
So do I understand you right that you feel it's important that only illegal content is blocked?
What I wanted to say was that it is important to distinguish between illegal content and harmful content. Illegal content is content that states can, by penal law, force platforms to take down. But what states should not do is to push platforms by soft pressure, by encouraging a self-regulation to act as censors on their behalf with vague goals such as fighting harmful content. That is dangerous. That can lead to wrong priorities. I think Angelica wanted to come in on that.
Not exactly. I wanted to come back a little bit to the first question about coronavirus. Because I think for the audience, it might be interesting to know that the European Commission released a report, I think last week, on the assessment of the Code of Disinformation and the different what the platforms that were signatories to this Code of Disinformation, Code of Practice on Disinformation had implemented during the period of during this period, still COVID, and so I mean, and from their assessment, I mean, and from the different practices that the platforms implemented, you can really see a willingness to sort of show more transparency or to, change the tone when it comes to this. So I think it's interesting, and I think if you're interested in that, people should go see it.
Thank you. Matthias, I would like to come back to you with a question from the audience. Someone is asking, how do you differentiate between content moderation and censorship?
Oh, censorship is what the people whose content disappears call content moderation. It's a bit like Napoleon said, a language is a dialect with an army. It's really a question of definition. And I don't like the term censorship. You shouldn't use it for platforms. You do not engage in censorship. Censorship is if the government tells you can't publish critical opinions on the government. So it's really something you should use within a state context. Just like the word torture, for instance. You need a state context for that. Companies have to engage and do engage in online content moderation, online content governance.
Thank you very much. Another question from the audience is, what are the possible solutions for transnational governance of AI in content moderation? For example, regulating TikTok, Chinese company, in the EU. How was the discussion among fellows with diversified backgrounds? How did you reach a consensus? Who would like to take that question? Angelica, would you like to?
I think that I can speak for the discussion ongoing with the fellows and the different backgrounds. And I think it went quite well. Even we had people that come, we have fellows that come from China. So yeah, but I think, I mean, they also, I mean, they agreed when we talked about achieving greater transparency, and although there were different nuances in what transparency might mean in one case another, so I mean, I think that shows that also that transnational agreements are possible. That we do want to, we all strive for sort of the same accountability and transparency when it relates to content moderation. So yeah, but I would stop there.
Okay, thank you. Nikolai.
As in a global world of digitalization, should be regulation should be international. And we have in Europe a really good example. So from the legal making opinion, the General Data Protection Regulation, the General Data GDPR is so an example how we can reach a consensus in understanding basic problems, basic understanding of data protection. So in you can see in Europe we have in Europe or in other countries we have also a different understanding what privacy, data protection, informational self-determination in German. But we are able to legalize it and to put this different understanding in one legal framework. And we have at the next part also looking for content regulation. We have a DSA, Digital Service Act. It's so big like GDPR. And I think with such European and then also worldwide legislation programs, we can go further. Other bad example, in my opinion, is NetzDG in Germany. So if we regulate it only in national borders, so it will be difficult in long term to have a consensus, international consensus.
So you have big hopes in the DSA. You think that that will be a good step forward?
Not really. I'm also, I've spoken about how we do regulation. But what is the output, like GDPR or the DSA, is another question. One problem by Digital Service Act is, like Matthias mentioned, the terms of harmfulness. And it is not clear what does it mean. How can especially small and middle enterprises to react on this? For big platforms like Google or Facebook, it's not problem. They have 100 of lawyers. They can do something. But for small enterprises and startups, it will be really hard to understand what should we do actually here. And I'm asking myself of such general big legal acts are really appropriate to regulate the digital world? Or do we need maybe some smart, small programs that distinguish what should be regulated? Should be regulated hate speech. So then maybe international regulation for hate speech. And we do not go. Sorry. It's enough now.
Okay. Matthias, you wanted to chime in anyway, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I love this, this interdisciplinary interchange. That's also what made the sprint so interesting. And I think that normative approaches, or the approaches of making platforms do something, can profit a lot from more philosophical reflection on the question of how can they, how can we legitimize their role? How do we, every time that some entity impacts your rights and your obligations, the things you have, the things you can say. This activity has to be legitimated somehow. It has to be explained to you. You have a right to justification to things happening to you. And a lot of the problems we have in our world today stem from the fact that people no longer understand what's happening. They feel impoverished in their choices. They feel like they can no longer make an impact, make a difference, and then that's when they, this anger gets destructive, and they unload against vulnerable groups. But I think that making institutions, making companies, making platforms explain what they're doing, and giving people the choice to engage or not engage, to give their data or don't give their data. This is such an important point, which I think shines through all of the three groups which worked on those issues for the last couple of weeks. That's so important. Thanks.
So it comes a bit back to what Nikolai said at the beginning, that you need to have the discussion. You need to open up the discussion with everyone and have these serious conversations.
Yes, and we've come so far. I mean, think of the last couple of months and how much we all talked about the role that platforms have in fighting COVID-related disinformation, in fighting election-related disinformation. None of the events that happened over the last couple of months could have been predicted. Suddenly, Facebook and Twitter were ready to put warning signs onto disinformation content. They were ready to put interstitials there. They were ready to introduce frictions. You no longer were able to share headlines of articles you hadn't read. All of this is possible. All of this worked out pretty fine, one would have to say, And the great thing is that now we know all of that is possible. Now the architectures of what's possible has been enlarged, and I think that now is an important point in time for anybody working on normative approaches to platforms to reconsider, to recalibrate their wishes, their suggestions on how platforms can make online communication spaces a tiny bit better.
Thank you. So another question from the audience is, what are the means of reconciling content moderation with data protection rules, especially when it is carried out by platforms which use encryption for protection of user-to-user communications? Who would like to take that question?
Sure, I'll give it a try. Well, I'm not quite sure whether I understand it perfectly, but I think one of the challenges behind this is that a lot of originally one-to-one oriented communication platforms have emerged as important communication spaces also for one-to-many communication. And perfect example of that would be Telegram. These companies or WhatsApp, and we know that these companies have become a haven for people that are slightly more distant from ideas of human dignity and deliberative democracy than we would like. And platforms have consistently proven reluctant to do anything about that content apart from ISIS propaganda and child pornography. The current legal setup isn't made up to deal with them because they do not fall, for instance, under the Network Enforcement Act. I think that this will be one of the bigger challenges that we might also see addressed in the Digital Services Act, because of course we have to ensure the privacy of one-to-one communication. The current EU approach to force those companies to provide keys is horribly wrong and pig-headed. But I do believe also, and this, you can see arguments, valid arguments on both sides, that we need to do something about the hate spreading on the platforms that originally were one-to-one communication platforms, but have now emerged as alternative platforms.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I would like to add that in the context of the research sprint, we also discussed this, and what was one of the topics that we might wanted to approach, because for example, in South America, WhatsApp is very dominant, And for example, with Rafael in Brazil, it played a huge a role in disseminating disinformation concerning elections, and that actually kind of won the elections for Bolsonaro, if I'm not mistaken. So this is for a region in specific is a really huge important issue, and that does and you know, WhatsApp is even a platform that's even more important than, or has more users than all of the others. So that was one of the reasons we want to tackle it, but at the end it got discarded when we did our narrowing down, which was very complex.
Okay.
But yes, I agree with what Matthias said.
Okay, thank you. Nikolai.
The interesting aspect is also looking for DSA. The platforms are responsible to deal with legal or harmful content if they get knowledge of this. How can they deal with illegal or harmful content if the communication is completely encrypted? So it could be also a main question in this context.
But to add on that, that's, you know, one of the issues that a lot of critics have with Telegram. Telegram is much less secure than it tries to portray itself as. A lot of communication, especially in the one-to-many category, is not encrypted. You have to switch it on even in one-to-one communication settings. So while I do agree that this is one of the challenges that current EU law seems to attractivize not caring too much about the content, because once you know about the content, you're responsible for it. There are some nuances and important nuances to that, and the Digital Services Act will have to make a choice on that issue as well.
Thank you. We were talking a lot about challenges in the past couple of minutes. What would each of you say is the key challenge one should focus on right now moving forward? Matthias, can I start with you?
Absolutely. I think the key challenge has to be to ensure a higher level of information literacy with the younger people, with users, also with second and third generation people with a migration background. So just to ensure that people are able to deal with the new communication realities which are here to stay. Platforms themselves have responsibilities. Their new role in as platforms for democratically relevant communication will make them fall under a number of new laws and regulations, undoubtedly. But I still believe that we have to start with the people. We have to start helping them understand what they see. This is the best, knowledge is the best immunizer, just as sunlight is the best disinfectant. Thank you.
Thank you. Angelica.
I would say that it's getting access to data for academics, civil society groups, and also regulators. And this has been like a call from all these different sectors for a while already. And we keep having this sort of, for example, from the European Commission and all their assessments that, oh, well, I mean, I think we're making progress, but at the same time, we really don't know because we don't have granular enough data. So that's, if we work, especially if we're working towards a new regulatory framework, we need to know how are these rules being, what are the rules and how are they being enforced? And we don't know that for sure right now. So for me, will be getting access to data for sure, the main challenge.
Thank you. Nikolai.
I'm by Matthias. In my opinion, the key challenge is literacy. Because such discussion shouldn't be only discussed in academic circles or political circles. Good example is data protection. It's very much discussion about it, but the normal people who deal with cookies and other things, apps every day, mostly don't care about it, and they understand this. I think it's not good communicate. They feel not the value of privacy. They can feel it's good if I take this app for nothing, for €0. But for privacy, what is it? I don't feel bad. So we need literacy to carry these values out, because if the people don't care about these fundamental digital rights, the politicians will be also not react in appropriate way. If you don't need these digital topics like privacy or content management for the election, so you will not deal with it, and you don't get. You are not in this topic, and it can only be carried by interested public, and not only by academic discussion. They are also very important. Academic discussion should show the way how to discuss, but these reflection processes have to be occur also in wide public spaces.
But Angelica, you said it would be especially important to have access to data. Nikolai, what do you think? Is access to data also important for the general public, or would they be overwhelmed and wouldn't know what to do with the data?
Access to data is important to create new services and public profits from these services. So access to data is too important, but we should distinguish about which data we are talking about. Is it a personal data? Is it geographic data? Is this what kind of data? So in this point, I'm a philosopher again. We go to back and ask what we are talking about,
okay.
About which data.
Okay, thank you. Matthias.
Just one comment. Nikolai said before about the wide access, and I misheard him first, and I thought he talked about white access. And this is something which I think is important too. Namely, we should really have to consider that internet, all questions of internet governance, including content governance, are questions the whole world has to be engaged in. And examples that we set in specific countries that might have a bigger influence on global on the global evolution of norms, especially those processes have to be very reflective of the consequences. Think of the Network Enforcement Act. We now have that law in about 25 other countries, often without the necessary rule of law safeguards. So we really have to make sure that discussions, that solutions we conceive of are tested against the problems of the world in multicultural settings in light of the challenges that other countries and other user groups are facing. The internet of the next years is not going to be a Western European internet. The next billion users won't be coming from Liechtenstein and Iceland and Norway.
And in this point, we should be able also to understand the problems of other cultures. For example, in America, the people should try to understand why are Germans so concerned about privacy, and we in our point of view, we should also understand that not all the world is so interested in privacy like we do it.
And I would like to come back to the general question of automated content moderation as a possible threat for the freedom of expression. What is your view on that? Is that a concern that is valid, or do you say it is so important to have content moderation that you have to ignore the fear of that the freedom of expression might be threatened? Angelica, would you like to go first?
I think it's a valid concern. I mean, it's happening right now. I don't think it's like an idea or like a threat or like some hypothetical scenario. Like as every now and then we get like these really high profile stories about somewhere content has been disabled or taken down, although it was legitimate content that should be online. And then everyone knows about these things that are happening, but they happen even more often than we realize, and for normal users and that don't make the news. So and the right to freedom of expression actually includes the idea that there should not be interference of any kind. So content moderation systems work ex ante, and when we block someone's legitimate post on Facebook, where we're infringing in their freedom of expression right, especially I think one of the things that is important is if after they don't have the adequate redress mechanisms to ask for a reinstatement of their content, and most like regular users do not understand, don't understand what's happening, why their content has been blocked. There's no recent explanation for this, and so I think it compounds the sort of injustice that you might feel. I'm speaking of as a regular user, so that's it. And then in other countries, the fact that there is an interference or a filter may amount to, and I know Matthias just said that he doesn't like the idea of censorship, but for some people, it might be some sort of censorship. So I think that we should be concerned about what algorithmic content moderation how it impacts the right to freedom of expression, but also the right to due process and to and having adequate redress mechanisms, which is one thing that I feel is missing in algorithmic content moderation systems, and that would make them better is the fact that they will be that they will have this sort of, maybe I don't know what type of software architecture, because I'm not an expert, but that would allow for users to instantly get a reason explanation, to instantly understand what's happening, to be able to get an answer from somewhere, which is not just one sentence or just like a small smiley face or sad smiley face or whatever. So I think we could improve, and if we improve, then we can find a right balance between algorithmic content moderation systems and the right to freedom of expression.
Thank you very much. So our time is almost up. I would like to ask you if you have any question for the other panelists. No questions, all is clear. Okay, then I'd like to ask all three of you to just give a final statement. Angelica, can I start with you?
A final statement about the fellowship, or I said that as a joke, maybe it didn't went out through, but I wanted to say that and I think I speak for everyone to say that the research sprint was a really great experience, that we learned so much, and also we just broadened our perspective with all the disciplines, and having, for example, this sort of debate that we're having right now, but on different levels with different disciplines and with very different topics or subtopics to AI and content moderation. And that we all think, and I think that was very collective, that we need a greater accountability, greater transparency, even though we all came from different backgrounds, as I already said. And that it was funny to see how we have, at the beginning, we thought we all have different takes on some concepts, for example, transparency. And towards the end, we realized that it was just a different language that we were using, or the different perspective, but we were at the heart of it, we were meaning all the same things. So that was really good, and that we all think also that it is possible to have an adequate oversight for online platforms, and that we can achieve a really good balance of interest between all the stakeholders. And I mean, that's possible.
Thank you very much, Angelica. Matthias.
There's a great saying by Bert Brecht in one of his pieces, imagine it's war and nobody goes there. That's the part everybody knows, right? But it continues, well, if you don't go there, then the war will come to you. And that's what we have been doing for the last couple of years. We haven't engaged enough with online content moderation, online content governance. Now the war has come to our steps, and we have to engage with it. We have to start thinking critically of the role of governments, the role of platforms, and what civil society can do to contribute increasing literacy. It's great that we've talked a lot about using algorithms to take down content. We also have to keep in mind that a huge impact is also algorithms amplifying certain kind of content, and perhaps that is the more important, the more interesting question for the coming years: how to ensure that platforms understand that optimizing only for engagement is a bad choice that leads to a destruction of the social cohesion necessary for functioning democracy. On that light note, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Nikolai.
Oh, my appeal is that we need more such projects, and interdisciplinarity is great, and multiculturalism also. Only so can we deal with digitalization. It is no other way in this context, and we must also not forget the philosophers in this discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Angelica. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Nikolai. So literacy, transparency, and information for everyone. More access to data for the academics, and a discussion, hopefully, with the entire world. Those are my main takeaways from today. Unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you very much to all of our speakers today. Thank you to the industry experts of Google and Facebook for your valuable support. Thank you, of course, to all mentors for their beneficial guidance. A big thanks goes out to WeShare facilitation team for making the sprint a rewarding digital endeavor. And of course, a big thank you to the HIIG project team. And I would like to thank all of you for your time, for your attention, for your participation. Today was a very insightful, innovative, and inspiring evening. We are looking forward to the next steps. And until then, take care, stay safe, and have important conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.